Hello everybody and welcome to this first in the series of EnviroForum by Ipswich City Council. I am Kate Wall. I am a consulting gardener based in southeast Queensland, and my specialty is working with helping everybody build in resilient gardens, which means getting the best out of your garden. But today we're going to focus on the resilience side of things. So how to have a garden that can withstand whatever comes along. And if 2020 has taught us anything, and that is anything could happen. So welcome to this presentation. I do hope you enjoy it. You are welcome to type in questions and I will answer what I can throughout, and perhaps a few more. I can't guarantee you I can answer your questions, but I will certainly try. You're also welcome to go to my website, katewall.com.au, and send me questions that way further down the track. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go to share screen and we're going to run through this presentation. Okay. Welcome to this presentation, Creating a Resilient Garden. This picture that you can see on the screen of a beautiful lush garden is actually my front garden. And part of what we're talking about here are things I have been putting in practice for many, many years. And over the years that I've been gardening in this garden, we've seen huge changes. We've gone through the millennial drought. We've gone through floods where my property was right on the very edge of the flood zone. So severe waterlogging, even though we didn't go underwater exactly. You know, a few houses down they did. So I have seen a lot of extremes in the 20+ years I've been gardening on this site. Who doesn't know this poem? That I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. This was written in 1908. We seem to think that droughts and floods are something that we deal with now and we didn't before. Drought and flood is something that is a natural cycle in Australia. It has always been there, and it's something that whether we garden in Brisbane or Ipswich or Alice Springs or Hobart, we all have to deal with on some level. So we do have a very changeable environment that we are gardening in. However, of course, climate change is massively accelerating that variability. And this is where we're starting to see things shift very dramatically from droughts to floods within the same year even. So it's this escalation of change which puts a lot of stress on our plants. It puts stress on us, but for plants trying to grow in any environment at all, change is a key cause of stress. A resilient garden is a garden that can cope with stress. And that is really what we're talking about today, how to get our garden able to cope with whatever comes next. If this summer is going to be a wet summer, will our garden cope? If it's going to be a dry summer, will our garden cope? Or anything in between. And of course, like I said, anything could happen. In dealing with plant stress, I am also going to throw into this mix gardener stress, because sometimes we can mollycoddle our plants so much and fuss over them so much we think we're saving them from stress, but it's causing us so much stress to do it. And this picture here is showing a garden. This is a Brisbane garden, even though it does look like a more cold climate garden, thanks to the lovely tropical birches in the middle. But this garden, we have done so much work on fixing up problems in our soil and strengthening our plants that this is one of the most resilient gardens that I am aware of. It takes whatever is thrown at it and it keeps flowering, it keeps thriving. Agapanthus do tend to struggle a lot in Brisbane, but this particular stand of agapanthus is one of the most glorious I've seen around, because where we are is a bit hot for agapanthus. Fine up at Tambourine, excuse me, or Toowoomba. But once you come down onto the flats where it's a lot hotter, and that's Ipswich, they do tend to struggle a little. This clump doesn't. But when we're talking about gardener stress, the property behind the back here, can everybody see this sloping lawn here? Imagine mowing that. Now, the old fellow who lives there does mow that with his mower on a rope and scrambling up and down. That's gardener stress. That's the sort of thing we want to avoid at all costs. So I have 5 strategies that we're going to cover in this session for building resilience into our garden. The first and the most important of all is to love your soil. Without good soil, you will struggle to grow a good garden in the best of times, let alone during times of stress. The second is to be water wise. That doesn't mean using less water necessarily. It means being sensible with the way you water. The third is match your plants, or at least your expectations, to your climate zone. It still surprises me how many people are growing things that don't suit our climate, full stop, and wondering why they don't work. Then we want to look at how we source plants locally and being observant. So let's run through that right now. With the start being, love your soil. Soil is the single most critical element in a garden, any garden, no matter where in the world you are. And if you are blessed with wonderful soil, lucky you. However, we still need to be very aware of what's going on in our soils. And if you are out in the Lockyer Valley, for example, you do have access to some of Australia's best soils. But on the whole, Australia is a country of very depleted soils. So almost every gardener needs to do something to improve their soil. Look at this picture of the soil. Can you see that there's lots of little sticky bits in it? You can see the fibres in it. There's lots of compost and organic matter in this soil. And that's really important. That lovely dark colour is an important indicator that you've got a lot of carbon in your soil, which comes from your organic matter. That's going to be critical. The importance that we are looking at here, and what I really want everybody now to start thinking about, if you were to go into your garden, and I know this picture shows a lawn, but it doesn't matter if it's lawn or garden, whatever you're trying to grow, and you were to dig a hole, what would you see? Would you see more like what's on the left or what's on the right? This is where we need to really think about what's going on underneath the ground. We don't see it, we tend not to think about it. However, what we are aiming for is the picture on the right, where we've got lush growth at the surface, the bit we can see, but there's lush growth below ground as well. We've got a dense and deep network of roots, and we've got lovely dark soil. On the left, the ground is heavily compacted. It's as hard as could be. You can see by how clean cut that is that that would not have been easy to dig. If it's not easy for you to dig a hole, it's not going to be easy for your plant roots to spread into that soil. And if your plant roots can't get into the soil, they cannot support the growth that you are after above ground. So the very first thing we need to do is improve this soil. And I think this motto here is quite an important one. We don't grow plants, we grow the soil. The soil grows the plants. If we all use that philosophy in our gardens, then when we want to grow plants, whether they be a cheap punnet of petunias or a really expensive tree, we're going to think about starting with the soil. And that's what I want you to start thinking about. If we can look at the soil first and get the soil to a condition that's pretty good, the plants are going to be able to grow without a lot of difficulty. This is where we tend to go wrong. Most gardeners will stick the plant in regardless of the soil, and it's amazing how many consultations I do where people have said, why is my plant not growing? They haven't looked at their soil. They've done no soil preparation, no soil improvement. They don't know anything about their soil. what they generally do next is fertilize. And that's about the worst thing you can possibly do. Never, ever fertilize a stressed plant. If your plant is stressed because it's not getting what it needs from the soil, you need to give it what it needs, and that's usually not fertilizer. Plants can't take up fertilizer when they're stressed. So all the goodness in the fertilizer tends to get washed away and completely lost. So it's a complete waste. But when you fertilize a plant, that plant also needs more water. So immediately you have to water. The plant isn't getting everything it needs. It's not in a happy place. So fertilizing it is kind of like giving kids lollies. You get that short burst, but you're not getting the strength that you're after. So steer away from fertilizers. And in fact, you probably don't need to fertilize very much at all, unless you're gardening in pots. That's a different story. But in the garden, if in doubt, add compost. Compost is far more valuable in the soil because the compost is improving the quality of your soil. It's putting the organic matter in your soil, which means it's not so hard. It softens the soil so the plant roots can get through. It helps, and it acts like a sponge in the soil. So it can hold water. So when you water, that water can stay there and the plants use it as they need it. When you do fertilize, that stays in the organic matter too, in our organic matter sponge. It stays there and the plants can take it up as they need it. Without organic matter, it's not going to stay there. So organic matter becomes the critical sponge in our soil for holding together good structure, holding in moisture, holding in air, because air pockets in the soil are critical as well, and holding in nutrients. It also holds microbes. We all know we need worms in our soil, but there's a lot more than just worms happening in our soil. It's an entire system of microorganisms working away to create good soil. So if in doubt, add compost. Homemade compost is fantastic. Everybody, please start some form of composting at home. Compost bin, chook pen, worm farm, whatever suits your situation. But composting, if you want to have a garden, composting is really quite an important aspect to that. Otherwise, you're looking at having to purchase in compost products, and there's a huge range of different products out there. So different gardens, what you have access to, what you choose, but diversity really is a good idea. Now this bottom picture here is again in my garden, and this is where I was at a point where a whole lot of things were ready to cut back. We're at the end of summer, so we're ready for a transition. Things do need a good feed at the end of summer, and at this stage I did put on compost. However, what I also do like using is a rock mineral product. A good rock mineral product will bring up the mineral components, the stuff that doesn't happen in fertilizer. So these rock minerals are all of the minor nutrients that are not in fertilizers. If you use that every so often, it doesn't have to be all the time by any means. I do my garden maybe once a year. And that just builds a lot more strength into the plants. What we're now looking at is giving our plants a good hearty stew instead of a quick junk food meal. So your fertilizer, think of as is like your Big Mac. It'll fill you up and keep you going, but long term it's not doing you any good. Whereas your compost and your rock minerals, that's your good hearty stew that is really building your strength. With that, as we all know, we're building our immune system. As we build our immune system, we're less likely to come down with everything that's going around. It's exactly the same for our plants. If you're only using fertilizer to feed your plants, they will get everything that's going around, in which case it's usually insects chewing and sucking the sap. So come back to the compost and think about, we want to give our plants strength, not just a quick fix. This allows them the resilience to cope with stress. Okay, moving on to being water wise. This is really quite an important one. And when this topic comes up, it usually comes up during times of drought. And we look at a picture like this, and this is what everybody thinks. We're not here to create a desert garden. Being water wise does not mean create a desert garden. And in fact, quite a number of the smaller plants in this photo would not survive in our climate, even during drought, because we still have high humidity. We're not in a desert, even though we may well be in drought. So we really need to think about the way that we use water in the garden. Having a low water garden is fantastic when we are in drought, but it certainly is not a good option when we're having a really wet summer and we're in flood. A good resilient garden can cope with both. An important aspect of that steps back to the soil. A good soil will hold water when it needs to and drain easily when it needs to. That's that nice middle ground that it can hold water, but it can also drain. A heavy clay soil holds too much water and can waterlog easily. Great advantage if you have drought, because it can hang on to the water, but as soon as we have a wet year, your garden is rotting. A sandy soil, on the other hand, is great during a wet year because it can drain, but in dry times it drains too well. In the middle is where we want to go. So, what sort of watering needs do your plants have? This picture here, this garden, is just as water efficient as the last one, and yet it looks a lot more lush. You absolutely can have a fabulously lush garden that is still very water efficient, and that comes down to the way you practice your watering. In this particular picture, out on the left are the plants that have lower water needs. They need to be watered less often. The ones on the right, that's this side here. I'm not sure if you're seeing things in reverse, but that's the way I'm seeing it. So this group over here definitely need to be watered a lot more often. However, they are clustered together so that it is easy to do that. The plants that need to be watered more often can be. When you go to water one of those plants, you're watering all of those plants together, and that can be a lot more efficient. In looking at your plant's needs, you also need to think about, are they deep-rooted or shallow-rooted? A shallow-rooted plant, for example, bromeliads, they work really nicely under trees because you don't have the root competition. They need regular small amounts of water. This includes ferns, bromeliads, orchids, lots of those sorts of very tropical looking plants. Like small amounts often. If you give them a very deep, long soak, it won't make the slightest bit of difference. They will still need a little bit more in 2 days' time. However, to look at some of the more deeper rooted things, they need the good deep soak. And now if we think back to our picture in the soil of the roots nice and deep in the soil, it's really important that we water deep enough. So think about how you are watering. The correct water pattern is going to be critical for making sure you've matched how you water with what your plants need. If you are watering your lawn, for example, the way that we were just talking about with bromeliads and ferns, small amount every couple of days, you are absolutely wasting every drop of water that you've put on it. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand the value of a good deep watering. We need to get that water as deep into the soil as we can. because in that surface zone, that's where the sun hits, that's hot. That dries out really quickly. We don't want our plant roots to stay in that zone. We want them nice and deep in the soil where it doesn't dry out so quickly and where we don't have the big temperature fluctuations. So to get our roots down there, we need to make sure we've got water down there. As you are growing your garden and you're getting used to what you need to do in terms of watering, the best thing you can possibly do is dig a hole. Dig a hole when you have finished watering and you think you've had the sprinkler on for an hour, you've soaked it as well as you can. Dig a hole and have a look. How deep did that water go down in your soil profile? If your soil is wet in the top 5 centimeters and dry below that, you have a problem. You need to get that water below it. Keep your sprinkler on for another couple of hours. I know that sounds like a lot, but what you are now achieving is you are getting that deeper soil profile nice and damp. Once you've done that, you should only ever need to water enough to top up the top 5 centimeters because it's easier to keep that deeper profile more moist. And if the top dries out a little bit, it won't hurt our plants because their roots are much deeper in the soil. That's where the resilience comes in. Because their roots are deep enough, they can take that bit of drying out at the surface. Through the awful windy weather that we've had lately, your gardens will cope. I've been looking around my garden at the moment after that weather because I've got building work happening, so I'm not able to get into my garden. So I was quite worried because of that awful wind. It has been truly awful lately and blown right through my garden terribly. I have one plant that looks desperate for a drink. My pot plants, that's a whole different story. But out in the garden, one plant is desperate for a drink. And that is one plant that hasn't yet got its roots deep enough into the soil. For the rest of them, yes, they've dried out, but there's enough moisture deeper in the soil to top them back up. I will go out and water to make sure that I will get that water level in the soil topped back up again, but my plants aren't experiencing the extreme stress that a lot of gardens are showing at the moment by the wind drying them out. And that's because I've trained those roots to be deeper by making sure I give them a good soak. A light watering can kill your plants as fast as not watering at all. So very carefully think about what does your plants need and dig a hole. That just digging a small hole will teach you so much about what's happening in your garden. Okay, so moving on. Match your plants and your expectations to your climate. This one is one that people miss a lot, and it seems like a bit obvious, but you'd be amazed how not obvious it really is. And I'm sure a lot of you are looking at this picture thinking, oh, what a beautiful tropical garden. And yes, it is. This is actually a garden in Melbourne. It doesn't look like Melbourne, but if you look very closely in, and I don't think the quality of the photo really allows us to, but the flowers that are in there are not ones that grow very well in our climate. We need to understand that we're gardening in a subtropical climate. What that really means and what makes the biggest difference for gardeners in our climate is humidity. Down in Melbourne and Sydney, and keeping in mind most of our garden inspiration does still come from cooler climates. So we're seeing these fabulous pictures and thinking this is what we want. What we've got to realise is they have no humidity in summer, or very little humidity in summer as compared to southeast Queensland. We have intense humidity. We're all very familiar with what humidity does. Now, Ipswich is a little less humid than Brisbane, And if you're in a pocket that gets frosts, this is important. If you do get frosts, and there are quite a number of pockets in the outlying regions around Ipswich that do get regular frosts, that is going to influence that what you can grow, and you will be able to grow certain things that the rest of us can't. But you're still very much on the cusp of where some of these things will and won't thrive. Now, what this particular garden designer has done is they've wanted a tropical style. So they have put plant selections in for plants that suit Melbourne's climate, but give the look. The particular plants that we're looking at in here, these little ornamental bananas, which are fantastic, these guys won't grow very well up here for us in Queensland. They are a cool climate plant. They look very tropical, but it's actually a cool climate plant. And the same with this palm up here. And these lovely big palms, they're actually, again, a cool climate version of what we are used to up here. So we need to look at plant substitution. Look and get your style that you want. Doesn't matter where in the world it is, but we look for substituting plants that like our climate. Now, importantly, I've also said match your expectations. If you are desperate to grow daffodils, by all means, go and buy some daffodil bulbs and plant them. However, if you expect to get flowers the first year and never again, you'll be happy when that happens. If you expect to get flowers from those daffodils every year, you will be disappointed. Match your expectations to what is likely to be happening. You'll get flowers the first year because those flower buds are actually set in the bulb from the year before, but they won't reset for next year. Now, this is where I want you to think about. There's, we have a beautiful bell curve there, and if we look at the middle part of the bell and say, this is us, this is our climate. If we're growing things that like this climate and our climate changes, we all know that things are happening that way. We've got plenty of room to move on this side. We've got plenty of room to move on that side, and our plants still cope. So, and we have absolutely seen over the years that very small shift. And it seems small enough to not be real, but it absolutely is real. Just 1.5 degrees can be enough to make a huge, huge difference. If you are growing something which you've already got it happening in a marginal niche, it doesn't really suit our climate, but you've managed to keep it hanging in there. You can see from here, you haven't got much room to grow until you've moved into where it cannot grow at all. Now, I've been talking to a lot of elderly gardeners lately who keep telling me these fabulous stories of growing lupins in Brisbane about 50 years ago, that it was actually not all that uncommon to have lupins growing. Lupins are a cold climate plant. You'll see loads of them in New Zealand. You won't see them in Brisbane. And it's really surprising to think that 50 years ago, they weren't uncommon here. The reason for that is they were happily growing in a marginal niche, or they may not have been particularly happily growing, but they were growing enough for the gardener to think they were happily growing. As our temperatures warmed just a little bit, just 1.5 degrees can make enough difference for something that is in the very edge of its tolerance zone to suddenly not be able to cope anymore. And I have been doing a lot of research on climate maps lately, and looking over the last 100 years, we have absolutely had that shift just in the last 30 years towards a warmer climate. Even though we have extremes happening all the time. We did have some very hot years back in the 1920s, but they were interspersed, whereas we've had consistently hot years since about the 1980s. That's why we don't see lupins in Brisbane anymore. which is also why I want you to think about the plant choices that you make. If you're choosing a plant that you know you're on the edge of the climate zone that it will take, and in this case, we're talking about temperature, but also humidity. Humidity is also important because plants have a zone of tolerance of humidity as well. If our plant is on the edge of that zone, it's not going to take a lot for it to not cope at all. The classic example of this is lavender. Lavender has very low tolerance for humidity, which is why an enormous amount of gardeners ask me why their lavender died suddenly. Humidity. We just had a very hot, humid summer. Lavender can take the extremes of the heat. It cannot take the extremes of humidity. Where it does well is where you have very good airflow and the humidity can't build up. So while we absolutely can grow lavender in the subtropics, you'll see plenty of it around in people's gardens. You'll always see it where there is very good airflow. So, for example, really open west-facing gardens where there's not many things growing to crowd around it. Never crowd your lavender. You'll increase the humidity around it. It's often grown out on footpaths where you have a breeze constantly available by it. Those sort of situations work. These are some of the things to think about. If your plant can't cope with the temperature and humidity that we have, it will be stressed and it will need a lot of extra care, and that creates gardener stress. Source your plants locally. This is also quite an important one. This is important because if you buy a plant locally that was grown locally, you know that it suits our climate. If you go to some of the large nurseries, you tend to find that a lot of their plants are shipped in from growers down south. When that happens, even if it's a plant that can grow here, often you find because it is used to growing in a very different climate, it doesn't adapt particularly well. Whereas if you are growing plants that have grown for multiple generations in our climate, it's going to be happy in our climate. So I do highly recommend when it comes to buying plants, check out your local markets. It's a great place to support our local growers. But also when you go into your nursery, ask them what they've grown themselves, where they've sourced it from. It does give you a little bit of an indication that the plant you're buying will suit the climate you are growing that plant in. So like I said, it comes to plants being better acclimatized. And here we're looking at a fairly common selection of plants, and yet if you bought petunias in Melbourne and brought them up to Queensland to grow, you probably find they just don't do as well as the ones that were grown for years and years in Queensland. They do work a lot better. Sweet peas is a classic case. Lots of people will go to the fabulous seed catalogues, most of which come from Victoria, and order their sweet peas. They'll have one good season and never get them to do much again, if they're even lucky with the one good season. But if when you get that one good season, keep your seeds, grow them, keep your seeds again. Those seeds now are plants that have grown multiple generations in your local climate and are becoming better adapted to doing well in your local climate. So by all means, local is a great way to go when it comes to sourcing plants. And it's always more fun, always more fun. Okay, now this is moving on to being observant. This is probably the last key element that I want to talk about here. And we just don't have a whole garden with little windows into what's going on underneath the soil. So it's not so easy for us all to look at what's happening underground and think, well, what do I need to do next? Is the soil dry? Do the plants need feeding? What's happening? We have to work that out based on what we see happening above the ground. So we need to learn to read the signs and symptoms that our plants are giving us. We've already talked about the importance of soil, and that's something that doesn't stop once you put a plant in. Those plants are busy taking all the good stuff out of the soil and growing it up into the part of the plant we see above the ground, the stems, the leaves, the flowers. To produce all of that, it's come out of the soil. So we need to make sure that over time we're topping up our soil. We're adding more compost, more organic matter, possibly more rock minerals, possibly sometimes fertilizer as well. But we're putting the good stuff back in periodically to support our soil, and that supports the strong growth we want to see. The sort of signs that we are looking for to see if we have happy plants or not vary, but the first and most common one is watering. Your plants will tell you if they need to be watered. If on a hot sunny day, as you can see in the picture, your plant, in this case a zucchini, so it's got really big leaves, a large surface area to lose water, is wilting like this, then you would expect this. If you stood out in the sun on a hot day, you would probably feel like wilting too. But as soon as you go and stand in the shade, you feel better. If you notice with your plants that as the shade of the afternoon comes across, all their leaves stand up again, it was heat stress, it was not that they need to be watered. If when the heat of the afternoon comes, they are still wilted, the cool of the afternoon, the shade comes across them, they're not in direct sunlight anymore, and they're still wilted, they're telling you they need a drink because they haven't got enough moisture around their roots to top up their leaves. That's one way to read the cues of your plant. If you go and water your plant when on a hot sunny day it's not wilting at all, chances are what you are doing is topping up the surface layer and giving your plant lots of little bits of water, and overwatering a plant can be just as detrimental to its health as underwatering. A waterlogged soil is not good for our plants either. So we want to find that really comfortable middle ground. Look at your plants. Are they looking stressed or are they looking happy? I think this is a great picture. I love the idea that a rose can be attacked by so many different things. So many books have been written about all the different bugs in the garden that it's really crazy actually that there's so many different things that are going to attack and hurt our plants. But I guess when we think about it, that's just the same with us. There's so many things that will get us if we don't look after our health. Any of these different problems are all caused by the plant being stressed. All of these pests and diseases can be avoided if we avoid plant stress. So instead of having a shed full of different chemicals to treat all of these different products, let's go back to the soil. Let's start with, have I got healthy soil for this plant to grow in? Why is my plant stressed in the first place to be attracting all of this problem? Have we had very dry weather and I have missed watering? Perhaps the plant is showing signs of stress. Not all plants wilt highly visibly like our zucchini did. Roses take quite a bit to show signs of wilting. Roses also love a really good deep drink. So if we've had a lot of hot, dry weather, once a week, give it a real soak. Then you'll know it's not water stress. Roses can be very drought tolerant and they like having nice deep root systems. With a lot of these others, it can be mineral deficiencies as well, that the plant doesn't have the strength it needs. Again, if we look at a junk food diet, we are not building strength in our bodies that we need to cope with the stresses of everyday life. Exactly the same with our plants. This is where I find the rock minerals particularly useful to make sure that we've got all of those extra minerals required in the soil to keep our plants growing strong and healthy. Interestingly, there is one little thing on this picture here which the label is completely incorrect and is not a symptom of stress. And that is, if we come and look at this section here where we've got beautifully neat circles cut into the leaves. Now the label here says caterpillars. That's actually not caterpillars at all. That's leaf cutter bees. The leaf cutter bees are taking out a piece of leaf and taking it back to build a nest with. So you will always see with leaf cutter bees very beautiful, neat holes cut that are all identical shaped. There'll be mostly circles and then a long ovoid piece as well. This has got nothing to do with plant stress because they're not actually eating a weak plant. They're not attacking the plant. They're harvesting material to make a nest with. So it's actually not hurting the rose at all. If you want a perfect leaf without holes in it, then you may not be impressed by that, but it's not hurting your plant at all, and it's not causing stress to the plant. But all of these other things can actually be dealt with. Instead of treating the symptom, treat the cause, and that cause is plant stress. Now, even things like the sooty mold, which roses can be prone to in humid climates, which is a mold, and the powdery mildew as well. These are fungal-based diseases. There's a lot of forms of rusts and molds that get into gardens. One of the ways of dealing with that is having enough microbes in the soil. Having microbes in the soil will eat the fungal spores in the soil so that they aren't there to cause the disease problem. The best way of having a healthy microbiome in the soil is to add compost. So once again, we've come full circle to the best way to have a strong, healthy, resilient garden is to add compost and look at having a strong, healthy soil to begin with. We look at our watering practices and make sure that we are watering our plants in a way that is efficient and suits the needs of the plants, whether that's a small amount often for shallow rooted plants or a deep watering once a week or once a fortnight for those deeper rooted plants. Both ways will be water efficient if it is what suits your plant's needs. So with doing all of this, we have now created a garden that can cope with whatever comes next. Now you can get out there and look at what sort of garden do you want. You can grow almost anything you like, so long as you bring it back to these 5 principles and look and watch what it's doing. Where you see a plant that is getting very attacked by insects, look at your soil first. Can you fix the soil? Look at your watering program. Can you fix your watering program? And then third, is this plant suitable for where I have planted it? It may well be that that plant needs to be moved to get more sun or less sun. Think about those sorts of things. Or is this simply a plant not well suited to our climate? If you've worked on your soil and you've worked on your watering regime and the rest of your garden is doing wonderfully, but you've still got 1 or 2 plants that are constantly being attacked, chances are those plants are not suited to the climate that you are gardening with in your property. Therefore, those plants are constantly going to be very high maintenance. It's then your choice whether you continue with a high maintenance plant that never fully thrives, or you take it out and look for an alternative, maybe something quite similar but better suited. They're the sorts of things that I want you now to start thinking about with your garden and how to make your garden more resilient to whatever may happen. This summer may well be incredibly humid, but with very little rain. We might get bucket loads of rain. we might be back in drought. Over the last couple of years, we have seen extreme low humidity in summer that we've never had before. And that's why we've had some of the severe bushfires up in Queensland that we've never had before. We've had bushfires, but the catastrophic bushfires that we've had over the last couple of years, that's new. That's an indication we don't have the humidity, because where we have good humidity, bushfires cannot become so extreme. The dampness in the air dampens the fire. So anything could still happen, but we want our gardens to cope. We want our gardens not just to cope, but to do well enough that we can still enjoy them, and we can still enjoy being gardeners, because trying to be a gardener when everything is an uphill battle is not fun. But gardening should be fun. Okay, so I have a question as what is the best compost? This is a great question. I like this question. There's no easy answer, because all compost has something to contribute. What I would like you to think about with your compost is diversity. The more different things you put in, the better. The best compost is probably the one that you can get the cheapest. Homemade is usually the cheapest if you have a setup. However, that not all of us can produce at home enough compost to cover our garden's needs. And this is, I'm sorry, the reflection of my glasses is probably rather disconcerting for you. I have spent many, many years composting in my garden, and I started here with such heavy clay that it was almost impossible to dig a hole. Nothing would work. So I needed enormous amounts of compost incredibly quickly. It was summer. Typically that's very hot time of year, which is a bonus. I was able to get my local gym's mowing contractor to drop grass clippings. So I had massive amounts of grass clippings in big heaps, composting away. They composted very quickly because it was summer, and that worked enormously. Since then, what I like using is aged horse manure. I have a place not too far away where I can buy it by the bag. When it's aged, it doesn't smell. When you're putting manure on and it's really stinky, it's not aged and you have the potential to burn. The burning is when you've got too much nitrogen. Your high nitrogen can burn plants. Any risk of that, put it in a heap anywhere, keep on composting that. It's not ready to use on the garden. But when it's aged and it doesn't smell anymore, which is where I'm getting this lovely horse manure that is well aged, it's fine. And I use loads and loads and loads of it. Now, I do that because I can get it easily and it's not expensive. I do also love to bring in anything else I find. So yes, I am that person out in the gutter when we've just had huge leaf drop, and sometimes it's deciduous, but most of the time it's the dry weather. Our trees here tend to drop their leaves when the weather is very dry. It's a drought survival strategy. So if you're seeing a lot of leaf drop in your garden and you don't have deciduous trees, it's a drought survival strategy, and a deep watering will fix the problem. But leaf drop is brilliant compost. So I'll get out and I'll bring all that. I've got a nice big chook pen. So for me, everything goes into the chook pen. The chooks can turn it and they eat what they want to eat, and what they don't gets dug back in. So, and I end up with this lovely black. Okay, now I'm just going to turn off the PowerPoint now so that I can talk more directly to you. So really it's up to you what you can get hold of. Don't use just one thing like mushroom compost. Mushroom compost can be pretty variable, can be high in salts, and it can be quite alkaline. So don't use it alone. If you've got a great source of mushroom compost, that's fantastic. But I want you to mix that with other things. So put that on the garden if it's composted enough, dig it in. But next time, use something completely different. Often during the really wet summers, when council are mowing the parks, we're left with big heaps of grass clippings. It's really easy to pick up. Don't use grass clippings as mulch, use it as compost. Put it in a heap and let it rot down before you put it into the garden. So we get the whatever different things you get, anything that was once living can be composted. So put all your kitchen scraps into your compost bin or your chook pen or your worm farm. If you've got things that don't break down particularly easily, like bones, fish, get a bit smelly, those sorts of things, dig a hole and do trench composting, because you can certainly dig a nice big hole, put all those things in, bury them. They will compost nicely underground as well as at the surface. So there's a huge array of different ways of creating compost. Okay, I hope that's answered that question. Compost everything. There's not one that's better than another in particular. It's diversity is a good thing. And I do like to add some rock minerals, because then I know I've upped all of the mineral content of my compost and I'm not looking at having deficiencies there. If you do want to use fertilizer, I recommend put a couple of handfuls of fertilizer into your compost and then put it onto the garden. And that way you run much less risk of any burning, and it's nicely absorbed into the compost. So you've got nice nutrient-rich compost. Okay, now we've also had a couple of questions come through before the event, so I might jump to some of those now. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to type them in and send your message along, and I'll address them as best I can. One of the questions that did come up was about self-watering pots. And I think this is an interesting one, because we were looking at how to water our garden. And sometimes self-watering pots can be a good solution, because pot plants dry out very badly. If we're gardening in pots, it's much harder work to get a good resilient garden, because pots depend on us entirely. A plant in the garden can send its roots out looking for water, looking for food and things like that. In a pot, it can't do that. It's entirely up to us to care for everything that plant needs. So it will need a lot more watering and a lot more feeding than our garden would. And yes, you can use compost in pots, most definitely. Always use a very good quality potting mix. Don't use cheap potting mix, because that compromise means that it's not good enough to support the plant. Good potting mix is essential for pots. I also steer away on the whole from coir baskets, and I prefer to use a plastic hanging pot that has its little water tray so that it can hold a bit. And that's because they get that extra airflow and they dry out so quickly. And when they dry out, it can be very hard to re-wet them. So having that little tray really does help. A self-watering pot seems to be the answer. It's got a tray of water in the bottom, and then the soil above that, the plant roots can access that water as they need it. There's a couple of drawbacks. The first drawback being that if we put in lots of little seedlings, for example, vegetable seedlings, into a nice big self-watering pot, and we're thinking about the end product, we're thinking about a nice lush vegetable garden, the first thing that's going to happen is, because those roots are only this big, they're not getting all the moisture down here, and the water down the bottom gets waterlogged and turns sour. That can be a problem. You are better off with a self-watering pot, using it for something that can fill the pot, so the roots can be extracting that water. Otherwise, when you only have roots this big, make sure you don't water it too much. Water it a small amount often until the plants are big, or you'll just get it turning waterlogged and sour at the bottom. The other thing that with self-watering pots is that people do tend to forget to water them because they have water in them. They do still need topping up, so it is still worth keeping an eye on them, because we rely too heavily on the self-watering part of that. But with pot plants, one of the biggest problem with pot plants is overwatering. So, you know, particularly with house plants, this is how people kill them most, is overwatering. So this is the magic stick. Stick it in your pot and see if your plant needs watering. and that applies to a self-watering pot or not. So if you're going with a really big pot that's self-watering, you really should be looking at having plants that really fill that pot. If you're looking at putting little baby seedlings in, can you grow them on before you put them in? Or only water it a little bit until they're big enough to fill the pot with their roots. And then gradually, as the plant gets bigger, gradually increase your watering so that those roots get deeper to match. So really the same principles apply to our pots. Is, what is the water needs of your plant, and match that. Some plants that like a lot of water are better in a self-watering pot. And I have found myself growing hydrangeas here in Brisbane do better in a self-watering pot. Okay, now another question has just come through. So I'm going to have to put my glasses on to read it though. Okay, hang on. About digging it in. With an old depleted garden bed with things still growing, can you add compost to the top or dig it in? You can add it to the top. One of the key things with compost is you don't want it to dry out. So we're not using our compost as mulch. And this is where you want to differentiate between compost and mulch. You don't have to dig in compost. The worms will do that for you. However, if you don't cover it with another layer of mulch, then you're using your compost as the mulch, and the mulch layer will dry out. As soon as your compost dries out, it stops working, and the worms don't want to dig it in. So yes, by all means, you can put compost onto an established bed. No, you do not have to dig it in, but do put, water it in well. We'll start the process really well, but then do put a layer of organic mulch over the top. That may just be sugarcane, or it could be bark mulch, or whatever you have. If you have a fairly dense garden bed where you can't see the soil and you're sort of tucking it in between the plants, that's actually fine to not mulch as such, because the sun isn't hitting the compost or the soil. So I apologise for that, for what's going on outside, but I suspect too we're pretty close to out of time. So let me first off thank everybody for participating. That is fantastic. And if you do have more questions, please do send through, have a look on my website, and please go and put some of this into practice. So thank you all for participating and enjoying the first in this series of EnviroForum for Ipswich City Council, because there are more coming up, which I'm sure are going to be fascinating. So do register and tune in again. Thank you, everybody. And I will catch up with you again another time, I hope, and hopefully at an expo again near you when we can do those things again. Bye.